Tacos and OBT is presented by Champ Honda. And Mace, we have a lot to get to the week of the draft. It is a celebration, and there also are some very interesting tools now. Years ago, there weren't these sort of tools for fans out there to do their own mock drafts. So I'm sure you're seeing it on your Twitter timeline. People will send you like, what do you think of my mock that I did for the Broncos with all these draft simulators? You've written about ESPN's draft simulator as well. I feel like Brandon Stokely talking about the golf simulators, but no, draft simulators at ESPN. But these tools are very interesting because it allows fans, draft fans, analysts like you and me to jump in and kind of see how the draft will unfold, because the draft, as Yoda says, is always in motion.
Always in motion, and that is one thing I'll say is a flaw of the draft simulators is they can't predict what kind of motion is actually going to happen. You can simulate a bunch of times and come up with different things. But what I wanted to kind of get to here is, we talk about how everyone's got their big board. I've got my rankings. You've got yours. I like to take a bunch of them and put them all together and kind of do a crowdsourced ranking that I'll refer to frequently as we get into the draft. But we heard last week George Payton talk about taking the best player. And so I thought, all right, in theory, if we were to follow the draft boards of people, like Matt Miller, like Lance Zierlein, like Dane Brugler, like Todd McShay, if we were to follow that to its conclusion and say, okay, at 67 and 68, the Broncos simply took the best player on the board in a draft simulation, who would they take? And so that was sort of the genesis of this. And while I don't think we're talking about something that will actually comport with reality, it's still very interesting to look at what came out and could illuminate where you find value in the draft.
Yeah, and that's what you're looking for, because you never know who's going to fall. You have to be ready for everything. And I think that's something where George Payton has pretty much said that. Like, we're going to prepare as if we're drafting. We're going to take BPA. And they're always going to listen to phone calls and conversation. So when you look at ESPN's mock draft simulator, what are some of the things? Because I think there's some themes emerging for the Broncos. And we'll get to a little bit later on about surprise picks. But honestly, I believe we kind of know what position they're going to target. And I think the mock draft simulators are showing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the simulators would show offense. I'll say this. We'll start with the fact that it basically distilled it down to offense. Every one of the picks made through 5 rankings and taking the best 2 players available end up on the offensive side. Now, it doesn't mean the Broncos might not look at corner, might not look at edge. I think these are possibilities. I am much cooler on the notion of edge rusher at 67 or 68 because I feel like you're not getting quality that matches up. What you're looking for is, how do you get the best player out of this? And maybe it's as simple as asking the question, where are you most likely to find a starter, someone of value there, sitting at 67, 68? Edge rusher, probably your chances are less than center, for example, although this is a weak center class. Tight end. And a position that kept coming up repeatedly as I did this exercise on Monday night was wide receiver.
Yeah, a wide receiver that this team definitely needs for sure. And it looks like Matt Miller had Malik Hooker.
Okay. Yeah.
Or excuse me, Hendon Hooker. Malik
okay,
Hooker.
Matt Miller. Okay, if we went by the rankings,
okay,
Todd McShay had Hendon Hooker number 46, and Matt Miller had him number 27. And as I did this simulation, in both cases, Hooker was still on the board.
I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't think that's going to happen. But if I was following the exercise to its conclusion, that meant I had to pick Hendon Hooker there, which does sort of lend itself to the conversations you and I have had. Neither of us expect Hendon Hooker to be there at 67. I don't even expect he gets to the second round at this point. But is there a juncture in the draft where if he's still on the board, you have the conversation, you think about making a move to get him just because you don't know what's going to happen with Russell Wilson this year. You've got to find a way to get quarterback right. And so it was interesting to view it in that sense. Now, in those cases, in those two simulations, one with off of Todd McShay's big board, one off Matt Miller's big board, then the next picks were interesting. On the McShay big board, it was DeJuan Jones, the tackle out of Ohio State. Now, the interesting thing on Jones is he's a right tackle. We talk about picking traits. 6'8", over 36-inch arms, 374 pounds. The footwork, he doesn't have quick feet, but he's got a lot of power, has to work on his hand placement quite a bit. But getting him at 68, he'd be intriguing, even though you just signed Mike McGlinchey. You could play the long game with him and say, all right, let's work on getting you ready to be a left tackle if and when we move on from Garrett Bowles after that. And then the Matt Miller simulation, that mock, the next player up after Hendon Hooker was Cedric Tillman. Okay, there's a lot to like about Tillman, but here's the thing with him: he doesn't possess traits that you don't already have in that room.
Yes.
Now, again, if you're taking it based straight up on the rankings, they say best player available, boom, Tillman would actually make some sense, but he doesn't bring something there you don't already have. To me, if you draft Cedric Tillman, you are basically saying, we'll take anything for Cortland Sutton. Because I don't
just drafted Cortland Sutton.
Right. You drafted a younger Cortland Sutton.
Yeah.
That's why, again, taking this exercise to its conclusion, it becomes a question of, okay, are the Broncos going to take the best player, or is it going to be just simply the best player for them rather than the best player available? Best player available might mean they take a player that doesn't necessarily fit something that they're lacking on this roster. But in the other exercises that I went through with the other rankings, we start talking about other receivers like Josh Downs, like Tyler Scott from Cincinnati, both of whom make a lot more sense than a Cedric Tillman.
Yeah, and Scott especially explosivo, not the Downs does. Downs is like a technician out there working underneath, working all over the field, especially in the red zone. So wide receiver, it's like, what do you want? I think explosion should be at the forefront, even if it's running back. Like they don't. I love Tavion Thomas. They don't need Tavion Thomas, and he's probably not going to do much in the pros anyway because he's a 2-down player. Like you need explosion. So if it is a Scott, if it is a Downs at wide receiver, that makes way more sense to me than a Tillman.
Exactly, and that's where, again, you're kind of going through this exercise to see what's there. But I think it does reveal what type of players are there. This receiver class, it's been a little bit dogged on in terms of this draft process, and because of the abundance of wide receivers from year to year, I think you're going to see some players fall. I think teams are going to take tight ends instead of wide receivers because of the scarcity of that skill set and how robust this class is. But you're looking for values. You're looking for underutilized assets. And what this does show is that, okay, it's not a huge year for wide receivers, but if the run happens at other positions, you might be sitting there with a very nice value at wide receiver staring you in the face at pick 67, pick 68.
And what's funny about this sort of exercise, one, the Broncos are doing this right now.
Exactly.
They've been doing it since we had the pre-draft press conference where Sean Payton pretty much admitted, and we know the calendar, Mace, so this is what they do, looking at mock drafts, running mock draft simulators. And then when I see the DeJuan Jones, offensive tackle, Ohio State, my first thought is like I've said before with Hendon Hooker, like, there's no way he's going to be there, but I also go back to when Draymond Jones came out. I had Draymond Jones as the number 50 overall pick. Broncos get him at 70, whatever number it was, but it was like well past 50. So there's no way Draymond Jones should be there at 50, and he was. He was well past 50.
I mean, where do you have DeJuan Jones? Probably somewhere in the 50s,
DeJuan Jones
right?
might be a first-rounder. I don't have him rated that high, but if there's a tackle run, and I believe there will be, there's a tackle run, a corner run, and an edge run, and 4 tight ends in the first round. and 4 quarterbacks. So all of a sudden, the first round is going to be tight ends, quarterbacks, edge, and tackles. So because of that, a guy like DeJuan Jones is going to be a premium second-round pick.
And it's because of that. You just named 3 positions that are premium. I'd say, the core 4 to me are QB, pass protecting tackle, edge, CB1. And that's, to me, that's part of why you could rationalize the Pat Surtain pick 2 years ago, is that he was one of the core 4 in terms of positions that you're trying to build. In that regard, the pick made sense. If the run happens, I think someone's going to reach on DeJuan Jones. The reason why I have him down in the 50s rather than first round is when there comes a point, and we've seen it, for example, with Mekhi Becton with the New York Jets. There comes a point where I believe you get too big to be functional.
Yes.
And you have a higher rate of injuries. I mean, if I were making a pick on film alone back in 2020, Mekhi Becton might have been number 1, number 2 overall. But I looked at his size, looked at the strain that was going to be on his joints because of that, and I thought, this guy's probably an injury-plagued career waiting to happen. And what's happened to him? He hasn't been able to stay healthy. That's my fear on DeJuan Jones, but it's also why you're talking about him, in my opinion, being day 2 rather than day 1. Day 2 is where you start getting some calculated risks, and then you really see it getting into day 3. But that's where you start seeing some dice rolls, and you look at DeJuan Jones and you see the frame and you see the film. He's got to clean up. He's got to have a few fewer penalties, but he can absolutely maul people. Yes. And I can see why a team might be seduced into taking him on day 1, but I don't think it's going to be good value because of the injury risk.
Well, and what I think is that there's a tipping point for everything, but there's a tipping point in the draft when you have so many tackles go off the board. Okay, is Jones worth that, or is that tight end that shouldn't be there worth that? That's what teams are going to have to decide, not the Broncos. But that also allows a guy like Jones. Some players get forgotten about, as crazy as that is. Like, you can actually slide a little bit more than you should. We've seen it time and time again. Players that can play. Keenan Allen should have never been a third-round pick. He had a PCL injury that caused people, give him some pause. Well, I think he's proved a lot of people wrong there. With Jones, even Hooker, we're talking about guys that have question marks, but man alive, depending on someone getting crazy, all it takes is one team to make that call.
It does. And the other thing is that when you're the Broncos sitting there, if you stand pat and wait for 67, 68, the question you may well be asking yourself is, what's better, tight end number 8 from a very deep class, or wide receiver number 7 from a class that is not bad, but relatively pedestrian by comparison to other years. And also asking yourself the question, knowing that wide receiver classes usually are very good consistently on a year-to-year basis compared to tight end, where there is a lot of annual fluctuation in the quality of the class. It's kind of like QB. We talk about some years being great and some years being dreadful. Tight end is much the same way because of the scarcity of the skill set.
Yeah, and this year is the year you want to get a tight end, and I think the Broncos will be doing that. Check out your draft simulators all over the place, and Pro Football Network has one, and ESPN, and it's a fun tool. It's a fun exercise, and again, it's one the Broncos are doing right now because you don't know who's going to be there.
I mean, I love having fun with it, Cease, because one of the things that I always like to try to do is create a mock draft where I trade every pick for future capital.
Okay.
I actually did it before the Broncos made the Sean Payton trade, and when I still had a late first-round pick to work with, and I was manipulating the third-round picks that I had. I had the first-rounder, and I was able to come up with 2 first-rounders next year as a result of all the
Wow.
wheeling and dealing. That was pretty, and I'm like, that's pretty exciting. And then I started trading like my day 3 picks as well. And I'm sitting there next year looking at my draft class. I'm like, I've got 16 picks here, and I got 3 first rounders. Now I really can go get Caleb Williams or Drake May, right? But they're not going to operate that way, even though QB next year it's in the back of their minds that
Yes.
as something that may be necessary. And we know that Sean Payton has already taken a gander at Caleb Williams and Drake May. We know what he said about Caleb Williams. So that is, it's not something that's going to be at the front of his mind, but it's going to be in the back of his mind. And it's a reason why, through what the Broncos may do over the next few days, the one thing that I would be genuinely shocked at is if they traded next year's first round pick.
Yeah, that's a no go for me,
Yeah.
for you, for George Payton and Sean Payton. And we've talked about it before, Mace, but I think it's worth bringing up based on your conversation here. The great thing about Sean Payton, perhaps the best thing about Sean Payton, is you're playing the long game. You're not thinking about, okay, we got to make a run this year. Like, if you do, that's great. And they're set up actually to do that. Maybe the Jets now get into that wild card spot. Like, that's a, interesting conversation. But they're no longer that desperation of like, we got to show what we got to do right now. It's like, okay, what's best for the long term? And that is seeing if Russell Wilson can do it. If he can't, being ready to take your quarterback next year.
Yeah, if they were focused on the short term and the urgency of the moment, they'd probably be doing more right now than they are. This is a groundwork laying time. This is running and lifting. They're not even meeting. They're not even learning the scheme. The point of this year is going to be establishing core competencies and building out from there. And also, as you and I have discussed, finding out who's coming with us, right? We're going forward. We're building this thing. The Sean Payton way is the Broncos way. Who's in? And this way looks a lot more Bill Parcellsian than anything the Broncos have experienced before. And like I've mentioned on past shows, it's what Bill Belichick did his first year in New England. The wins and losses come what may, but the focus of this year is building a core set of things that you can do well, which will help you in the short term, because last year the Broncos had no identity. What did they do well from week to week? What was their bread and butter? Nobody knew. Players didn't know because it was changing, and they were trying to install everything on the offensive side that they end up mastering nothing. The goal this year is to master some things, right? You start by mastering things that you do well, and then, even though you may not have as broad-based an attack as Nathaniel Hackett wanted to have last year, and of course couldn't build, you have things that you can do well, and then when you're struggling, you've got some bread and butter things on which you can rely and say, okay, fine. You know what? Our offense is in the tank. Give me the most reliable bread and butter play to get us 6 yards, right? And go forward from there. And great Broncos offenses have had at their core bread and butter concepts. Go back to 10 years ago. When things weren't going well, you could always dust off the bubble screen, right? And that could that would get you out of the funk and get you going. Last year, the Broncos didn't have that. If you build core competencies, you're going to have things that you can do and trust to, basically be the in-game equivalent of a streak stopper in baseball. They say, like, okay, your number one starter, if you're out on a losing streak, your number one starter comes and stops that streak right then and there. You need things like that you can rely upon in order to make sure that things don't go from bad to worse. And the Broncos didn't have that in 2022.
Go back 20 years to the Shanahan offense. Hey, we can't do much. We can run.
Yeah.
Mike Anderson or Landis Gary, like, it doesn't matter. Like, we can run. And
Run
that
and
core concept.
Run and play fake boot action.
Yeah.
You had it in both phases, right?
Yep.
And
if you run that to perfection, as Kyle is showing you with subpar quarterback play, hey, you run that to perfection, you can win a lot of games.
Exactly. And part of how those concepts, that offense, always elevates a quarterback one level above their natural level. So, yeah, but that's what was lacking last year, and I would say it's what's been lacking the last few years as well. I mean, there were there were some moments late in 2019 when it looked like they were developing a few bread and butter things with Rich Scangarello, and of course he worked under Kyle Shanahan, and so thus it doesn't surprise you that maybe he had a little bit of that there. But then with Pat Shurmur and Nathaniel Hackett, it was just like, what the heck? We actually didn't start seeing some core competencies emerge until Justin Alton called the plays the last 2 weeks of the season.
Right. With Pat Shurmur, their core concept was throwing incompletions. But I like in that last tirade, Mace, you went a little bit of Jerry Maguire, who's coming with me. You went a little bit of James Hetfield, talking about master. You got a master of puppets. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, we run the gamut on this show. But I think Sean Payton is going to have a little Jerry Maguire. Who's coming with me for 2024? Yeah.
Who's on the lifeboat? Like, I mean, and we'll go Deion Sanders here. He will bring his own luggage with him. He's brought some of his luggage with him already.
That's right.
Yeah. You're, old friend of mine, Jim Sacamano, friend of yours as well. You're in or you're out, right? It's two things. Are you in or you're out? This year you're going to find out who's in, right? We're gonna learn that over the course of the next several months, and the answers either way might end up surprising people.
Before we tie a bow on the draft simulator conversation, and God bless America Stoke for putting simulator in my mind because it's simulator, but anyway,
better than stimulator.
Simulator.
Maybe you're counting. Maybe you're counting on the simulator to stimulate conversation, and we'll make a, make a reference to High Fidelity, right? So, conversation stimulator.
I think Sandy did some commercials for the stimulus there. But anyway, let's talk final thing. The Broncos also have to decide whether or not if the same is good or better. Because I'll bring up A.T. Perry, a wide receiver that we didn't talk about and shouldn't be in the third-round conversation. You and I love his game. But let's say fifth round, something like that. If they're staring at A.T. Perry's situation, who's basically the young Tim Patrick, okay, do you need that? Or is what you have already good enough? This comes into the Sutton conversation. So I think with these wide receivers, you're going to have to look at that and say, well, this is what we have. That's kind of already what we have. Is new better is what I'm trying to say.
Well, if you're viewing over the horizon, though, with Tim Patrick, and Sean Payton has talked about kind of viewing what year 2, year 3 looks like in terms of what they would plan for these players. And you're looking at Tim Patrick's contract, effectively it was a 2-year deal with the chance to bring him back for year 3. Well, last year's gone. You're going into the second year of that. The second year of what's effectively a 2-year contract. I would think long and hard about A.T. Perry. If he's staring there, sitting there in the 4th round, staring you in the face, unless you've somehow gone receiver in round 3, I think you got to think about A.T. Perry there in round 4 or round 5. The skill set is there. I no matter what works out for you at wide receiver 1, I think Perry becomes that perfect complement to whatever you need. And I think he'll be a plus player on special teams right away. He certainly got the mindset and the mentality for it.
I love this show every day because we're some chatty blankety blankers, and it's like we spent 20 minutes on draft simulators. But I'm going to skip over the safety dance thing real quick, but tie the show up with any surprise picks because it ties into what you just said. Okay, back-to-back receivers, that would be a surprise. But honestly, I was just on the drive before the show, and I told Derek and D-Mac, there's no position. If it's quarterback at 67, I'm not going to be surprised. If it's running back, obviously not going to be surprised. Is there a possibility of any surprise picks for the Broncos where they currently sit?
Not really, no. And their roster is in a very unique spot here. Because they didn't have first and second round picks, they went into free agency saying, all right, if we've got these holes in the starting lineup, we got to fill them right now. And they did. By and large, they did. They got themselves a right tackle. And they got themselves a left guard to replace Dalton Risner, who, by the way, is still unsigned. Can you believe that? No one signed Dalton.
The streets are cold, man.
Yeah, they are. I mean, ex-Bronco Connor McGovern got scooped up before Dalton Risner did because McGovern's going back to the Jets. So they don't have a position where you say, okay, they have to get a starter right now. Some would say center. I think if they don't get a center, they're okay with Lloyd Cushenberry there. And there are some Sean Payton staff LSU connections that may have them thinking more of Cush than perhaps Broncos country does at this time. So you look at that and you say, all right, there's not a position where you say we have to get a day one starter right now. That means you can be flexible. But the thing is, there also is not a position where you say, I'm so confident in the depth that we don't need to add to it. I'm so confident in what we've got that we don't need somebody to be developing as a starter for 2024. That isn't the case. Like every position group on the roster could use some depth fortification, maybe QB. But the thing is, if you're not sold on Russell Wilson, you need to consider bringing somebody else in to throw another dart at the board and see if you can find that quarterback through another means for the long term. So yeah, I mean, you go down the list, every position group sees they could use somebody, right? And so that makes them that puts them in a good position to sit there and say, just trust the board and like to circle back to the draft simulator. If the top guy on their board is Josh Downs, pick Josh Downs. That's it. Even though you may say, oh, well, we got receivers coming back. We're not sure we can make him fit. You're not concerned about that. You're just saying, get me the best players, and we're going to work it out from there.
What's great about that, Mace, is you highlight it's not necessarily stress-free, so I don't want to say that and be like, they just kick their feet back. But, like, it's just trust the work you've already done. There's no overthinking. And for me personally, it's why I love the month of April for what I do, is because I don't have to study anymore. You know, maybe some small school guys or somebody I haven't studied enough, but like the Broncos, there's no paralysis by analysis.
Yeah.
You've done your work. You've done the simulations. Now let the draft unfold and take what you get.
Right. And then if let's say the top guy on their board is somebody that, he might be available in 10 picks. Trade down, get more capital, and that's something for everyone to keep their eyes on as well, because I don't think George Payton wants to only have 5 picks when all is said and done. I believe he'd like to get that number to lucky 7, which of course is what you come in with. That's your baseline every year. I think if he could get to 7, even if it means doing some pick splitting on day 3, I think he'd be a pretty happy camper with what he got.
And if they don't, I believe with the Walton Penner Group's checkbook, they're going to be incredibly active in the UDFAs. And
yes.
If they what are they going to add? 15 UDFAs?
15, and I think some may be significant signing bonuses.
Maybe 2 or 3 guys make the active roster, not just one.
Yeah.
Like, that's how significant they could be. So George Payton will try to get more picks. If he can't, I think it just means more active, more stress on priority free agency.
The interesting thing will be if they see a guy that's falling in the 7th round and they love, will they make a deal to get one more pick and maybe sacrifice some future capital? Or maybe there's a low-level player involved that they just want to divest themselves of. And that's something to keep your eye on as well. I wouldn't at all be shocked if we're sitting there and the draft is winding down and we suddenly hear, the Broncos are on the clock because they traded a backup player for a 7th-round pick because there was somebody they really wanted right then and there. I mean, what if Aiden O'Connell slides through day 3, right? I mean, you think they wouldn't make a trade to throw a dart and make sure they got him on the roster? There are a lot of possibilities here.
Absolutely, and 100%. Orange and Blue today, presented by Champ Honda, Cecil, Lammey, Andrew Mason. Tying a bow on today's program, tomorrow's topic is going to be very juicy. Could the Broncos mess up this draft? We're going to zip the lip until then, so make sure to stay tuned, 3:30 p.m. on all of our social channels. Make sure to check us out on YouTube, like, comment, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you never miss a vid and help us grow our YouTube channel. Watch to the end of the video. It helps the YouTube algorithm, and, like and comment and do all those things. I know it's annoying when I say it, but it really, really does help out the channel, so we appreciate you for that. He is Mace. I'm Cecil. We are OBT. It's a BFD, and until next time, be safe, Be kind. Know that you are appreciated. Stay tuned. And as always, please, would you stay frosty?